Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Megan Hoyer. I'm the Director of Public Programs and Public Engagement here at the Whitney, and it's my pleasure to introduce tonight's program, My Life with Warhol, which brings together some of Andy Warhol's closest associates to share their memories of the most famous artists of the 20th century and to consider how Warhol's life informs our thinking about his art. Tonight's program is, in case it wasn't obvious, organized in conjunction with the extraordinary retrospective of Warhol's work, Andy Warhol from A to B and Back Again, currently on view in our fifth floor galleries. Curated by Donna De Salvo, the show is the first exhibition to consider the full arc of Warhol's artistic practice, beginning with his commercial work in the 1950s and touching on every period and every medium that Warhol worked in. Thank you, Donna, for this incredible show. And I'll get back to you in a minute. But alongside this depth and breadth, Holland Cotter, in his review of the exhibition in the New York Times, wrote that the show that Donna has put together presents, quote, a human scale Warhol. Again, a quote, a figure we seem to have lost track of, and one who young artists today can identify with and treasure. The Warhol for whom art, whatever else it was an expression of personal hopes and fears. Our hope is that tonight's conversation will continue to reveal this Andy Warhol. So unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Irving Blum is unable to be here tonight, and we are so sorry that he couldn't join us. I think Donna will share some of Irving's insights on Andy during the program, but I also wanted to quote him as I think he summed up exactly why tonight's conversation will be illuminating. He said, quote, Andy was extraordinary. I mean, he was very straightforward, curious, interested in talking, interested in everything that was going on. So now I'm honored to introduce Vincent Fremont, Bob Colacello, and Donna De Salvo. Vincent Fremont began working for Andy Warhol shortly, and these are their Warhol bios, I should say. Vincent Fremont began working for Andy Warhol shortly after arriving in New York in the summer of 1969, eventually serving as vice president of Andy Warhol Enterprises. In the 1970s and 80s, he produced and developed video, television, and film projects with Warhol, including Andy Warhol's 15 Minutes for MTV, Fight, starring Charles Rydell and Bridget Berlin, and Phony. Following Warhol's death in 1987, Vincent was instrumental in forming the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. From 1991 to 2010, he was the foundation sales agent, and he has also worked as an art advisor. And finally, Vincent is also a documentary filmmaker, and with his wife, Shelley Dunn, co-directed and co-produced the documentary Pie in the Sky, the Bridget Berlin story. Bob Colacello is a writer and a photographer. He studied film criticism at Columbia University and began his writing career in 1969, publishing film reviews in The Village Voice. And he caught Andy Warhol's attention when he reviewed Warhol's trash, labeling it, quote, a great Roman Catholic masterpiece. In 1971, Warhol and Paul Morrissey approached Colacello to write for Interview magazine, and within 6 months, he was made editor, a position he held until 1983. During those 12 years, Bob was directly involved in all aspects of life and business at the factory. He is the author of Holy Terror, Andy Warhol Close-Up, first published in 1990 and recently reissued and available in our bookstore downstairs. A collection of photographs of the factory years, Bob Colacello's Out, was published in 2007. In 2014, he had a solo exhibition, Bob Colacello, Holy Terror, Photographs from Inside Warhol's World at Stephen Kasher Gallery, and there's probably many things I'm leaving out, I'm sorry. Finally, Donna De Salvo joined the Whitney in 2004 and was appointed the museum's first chief curator in 2006. With the opening of our amazing new building here, which Donna was instrumental in building, she assumed the role of deputy director for international initiatives and senior curator, and is leading the museum's efforts to define and communicate an expanded notion of art in the United States, both domestically and internationally. Among her many other duties, she oversees the Andy Warhol Films Catalog Raisonné project. A noted expert on the art of the 1960s, and Andy Warhol in particular, Donna was previously adjunct curator for the Andy Warhol Museum and is was the curator of Andy Warhol disaster paintings, 1963, at the Dia Art Foundation. Andy Warhol hand-painted images, 1960 to 62, also at Dia. Success is a Job in New York, the early art and business of Andy Warhol at the Gray Art Gallery, and a retrospective of the artist's work held at the Tate Modern in 2002. From 1981 to 1986, Donna was a curator at the Dia Art Foundation, where she worked closely with several artists, including John Chamberlain, Walter D. Maria, Donald Judd, Cy Twombly, and Andy Warhol. So the last words are Andy Warhol. And please join me in welcoming Vincent, Bob, and Donna to the stage.
Thank you, Megan. Are we on? You can hear us? Hear me?
We are.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, I'm just so delighted to be here this evening with all of you and with Bob and Vincent, who I've actually known for quite some time and have been great supporters, friends, and colleagues along the journey. There's so much to talk about. I don't know where to begin.
Okay,
I always think it's bad. Flashing on the screen behind is,
Oh, yeah, I can sit back
and you
there.
can see all of that. A bit of a
Unlike Andy, I'm not into high tech. The newest tech.
bit of a family album. But Vincent, in the Cast the Cold Eye catalog, which you contributed to, I found this quote that you included from Andy Warhol, which I just like to read. Something that I look for in an associate is a certain amount of misunderstanding of what I'm trying to do. Not a fundamental misunderstanding, just minor misunderstandings here and there. When someone doesn't quite completely understand what you want from them, or when they didn't quite hear what you told them to do, or when the tape is bad, or when their own fantasies start coming through, I often wind up liking what comes out of it all better than I liked my original idea. Is that sort of a driving force that permeated your time working with Andy in the factory years, or Andy Warhol Enterprises, I would say?
Well,
I would say that applies quite directly to like the way the philosophy book was done. The philosophy of Andy Warhol, From A to B and Back Again, which actually Vincent was with Andy and me at a cocktail party on Park Avenue, and this woman came up to Andy and said, I'm a literary agent, and you know what you should do? You should write your philosophy. And Andy, got ideas from all over the place, but he always knew when it was a Warhol idea, and he right away turned to Vincent and me and said, oh, we got to, that's what I should do. He never wanted to do an autobiography. He never wanted to do a memoir. And the next day he started tape recording me, and he told me to start writing it. And then he brought what I wrote. He gave to Pat. He read over the phone to Bridget Berlin. Then he gave Pat Hackett the tapes with Bridget's comments, and this is how it went. And we would hand in pages to Andy. He would read them. We were all channeling his voice, but we also invariably there had to be something of our own in there too.
it's not easy to channel Andy properly. Some people attempt to do that, and they go off the rails the wrong way. You have to really think. And Pat, Bob, and Bridget was the whole cleaning chapter. I did a couple of shopping. I went shopping for underwear.
At Gimbels.
Yeah, Gimbels. I don't think that made the book, did it?
No, it did. It was Andy had this
remember.
obsession. Oh, you know what we've got to do, Bob? We got to go shopping for underwear at Gimbels. I was like, what does that have to do with philosophy? And Vincent came along, and Andy taped us both, and so we were both we were two Bs in that chapter.
Yeah.
So let me just sort of rewind a little bit, speaking of tape. So we know when each of you began to work with Andy. So you're in 1969, part-time, and Bob, you were coming in 1971, correct?
70, actually.
70.
But I started working there, so
right.
In 70 I was mainly handing in reviews.
So tell me what your impressions were of Andy Warhol, or Andy, before you actually started those jobs. Like, what did you know of him? What did you think of him? Can you talk a bit about those pre-Andy days, basically?
I mean, I grew up in Long Island suburbs. I went to MoMA or the Met once a year on school trips. I didn't come from a family that was collecting art, but I saw, like many Americans, in Life magazine and Time magazine, starting in the 60s, the images of Elvis, of Marilyn. Those were my favorite stars. My sisters and I went to every Elvis Presley movie. My mother took us to see Some Like It Hot about 6 times. You know, so Andy almost got me interested in art, one could say. By the time I was at Georgetown, 1965, Chelsea Girls came to Washington. I went to see that about 5 times with a few friends of mine. We were the only sort of bohemians at Georgetown at that point. And, you know, I could vote for the first time in '68, and I actually wrote in Andy Warhol for president because
Are
I
you
didn't want.
serious?
I'm
I never
serious.
knew that.
I didn't want to vote for Nixon or Humphrey. And so, you know, when I got this phone call from the then editor of Interview, Soren Anjanou, saying that Andy and Paul Morrissey had been reading my film reviews in the Village Voice and wanted to meet me and hoped I would write for this new magazine, I was like, you know, beside myself. My parents were also beside themselves, but in a different way.
But see, both my parents were artists, and I'm from California, so I grew up with a lot of art around me and artists coming over. I was aware of Andy's work very early on, because my father was in a gallery, Esther Robles Gallery on North La Cienega, which wasn't that far from the Ferris Gallery. And after my parents got divorced, I moved back to San Diego. I would come up on weekends and go to the Cinematheque 16 on Sunset Strip to see Andy's films. I went with my father and my stepmother because I was too young to get in. I couldn't get into the trip when the Velvets came because I was too young, but I was very aware. So by the time I'm in high school in Point Loma High School in San Diego, I'm a total fan of Andy's. I'm going hitchhiking to La Jolla to go to the Unicorn Theater to get underground newspapers to find out what's happening in New York. So Andy does come to San Diego. He actually did show up to San Diego State because he got in trouble. He did a college tour and he got Alan Midget to impersonate him. They all caught on eventually, and he got, you know, the shit hit the fan. So he actually did show up with Paul Morrissey and other people, and then he also shot San Diego Surf in 1968, and he was staying with the San Diego Police Department waited and wanted to bust his entourage. So I knew a friend who knew who had a father who was Judge Ruffin, who was a judge who then had Andy stay in his house and compound so the police couldn't get to him because the San Diego police were completely insane. And I meet Andy, so going forward, I'd graduate from high school and then I'd go to New York in 1969.
And does he reach out to you to hire you, or how does that?
Well, two of my friends, I had high school friends, two of them, Michael and Tim.
Yeah, is this the Babies?
Yeah.
Okay, could you
You
say?
don't want me to go there, do you?
Well, I just, you know, I was a little interesting fun fact I didn't know about. A conceptual group, it said, was it maybe, are these your words?
No.
The group that came from
That's
nowhere.
Danny Fields.
Yes, the group that came from nowhere that did nothing.
That was
That's
our
what you were described
Well,
as.
here's just
I just thought it was sort of great.
Well,
What is
it was
that?
actually it was true because after we got out of high school, we started grooming ourselves into we became this kind of rock and roll look, very androgynous LA rock and roll look, very long hair, flashy clothes. We were adopted into the GTOs, the Girls Together Outrageously, who were the first kind of organized groupies in LA. They did one album with Frank Zappa, and so as time went on, we had this ridiculous idea that we were going to be in the music business. Except the real problem is we didn't play instruments, so we were writing lyrics. So we actually got a manager, a friend of my mother's girlfriend, and so he actually drove us across country. We arrived in Manhattan the weekend of Woodstock, so. They had met him, so I think the second or third day that I was in New York, we go to Andy's studio with Mexican theatrical mask. We give him, and my friends leave, and then I'm with Andy probably a couple of hours, and he gets out his Euro tape recorder, which is, it's the big box, reel to reel, and he basically interviewed me the whole time, and little did I know that I'd be working with him. So I would go back and forth and go to Max's and stay up all night and then go to, it's a long story.
So what did you do when you first started working for him?
I just got to know him, and then he hired me.
What was your job at the?
I didn't
in
have a
those
job,
early
I was
days?
freelance at that point. He asked me to do the old Calcutta. He was asked by Diners Club magazine to cover "Oh Calcutta," the all-nude musical review that was in the East Village. Now this was roughly a year after the attempted assassination. He wasn't going to go down, and do that. So I went and interviewed people. I don't remember having a tape recorder, but I interviewed them at the beginning, why they wanted to go to the show, at an intermission, and then I came back. I never saw the show.
Yeah, can you talk, both of you, about actually, I mean, just to go in a kind of chronological way, and part of the exhibition here is to some extent, you know, tries to challenge the idea that after '68 and after the near fatal shooting attempt, in a sense that, you know, the career went down. But could you talk a bit about, you weren't there at that time in the shooting, but
No.
things were still a little edgy
Yeah.
at that time. Can you say something about what the vibe was like in the, were you still even calling it the Factory at that point?
Yes.
In '69 or something?
Yeah, or did
Well, he
it
was
really?
shot at
60
33 Union Square West,
Yeah.
the
Right.
second factory, not shortly after they moved there. When I got there, I mean, they had an attempt at a security system. You sort of got off the elevator, and there
Oh,
was
is this
there
Mike?
was a
Is this
vestibule.
Keith Saunier?
No, that's later.
No.
That's
Okay, I'll
ACC
ask about
Broadway.
that.
Like a sheetrock vestibule with a steel, like bulletproof
That was
door with a little
860 for
window.
that.
No, but that also
No,
was.
but the vestibule, but the one for 33
there was a
Union
door
Square
that
West,
you had to be
because
buzzed
what
in.
happened, like when I arrived in '69, it was the Dutch door. That was the security. Maybe Joe D'Alessandro was sitting at a desk, you know. But you could reach in and unlock the door. You could still be buzzed in. I had during that first part of working with Andy, '70. You might have, but there was an armed robbery. I had just left.
You were there for the armed robbery?
No,
weren't
it's been written about that I was there, but I wasn't.
So that's
I had
incorrect,
just
okay.
left for a screening.
But there was a door.
Yeah. So what happened? That was the last straw because everybody's hiding behind doors. We put a bulletproof door in right off the elevator, and so you had a little glass bulletproof viewing thing, and that was supposed to intimidate people, which it did,
Well,
except
yeah,
for
I
Paul
remember
America.
Soren Ingenue when he told me to meet him at 33 Union Square West on the 10th floor,
Right.
where Interview had like a storage closet for its, and they'd only been in existence about 8 or 9 months and done about 5 or 6 issues. So then he took me down to the 6th floor to the factory proper, and I remember looking through the glass, and there was Andy sitting at this little Art Deco desk, eating his lunch, which consisted of spinach and carrot purees from Brownie's health food store. Because, you know, after he was shot, he was operated on for 5 hours by 5 surgeons, and he never regained the elasticity really in his stomach, so he wore a girdle, and he ate very soft foods at that point. And he buzzed us in. There was this stuffed Dalmatian, which I guess Andy had been told was Cecil B. DeMille's
was
dog.
proven that later it wasn't.
When that appeared in print one time too many, Cecil B. DeMille's sister wrote a letter saying, "It's not my brother's dog. He would never stuff his dog." And so, but Andy buzzed me in with Soren, and the first thing he said to me is, "Oh, hi, gee, oh, you write really great. Oh, would you like some lunch?" And he passed me this plastic spoon. I was like, Andy Warhol is offering to share his lunch with me. But, you know, there was, you know, if you'd be walking up Park Avenue South, like to look for a taxi, and you saw a kind of homeless person, or Andy would say, suddenly want to go into a store, or actually cross the street. He was still very paranoid about people who looked odd. And Paul Morrissey and Fred Hughes were in the process, I think, of really filtering out a lot of the 60s superstars. The drag queens
Well,
can't
don't you remember when I had to leave New York in January of 1970 because the draft was on and my birth date was number 26, so I knew I was going to be called up. So I went back to LA. So it took me roughly a year. I come back December of 1970. So when I come back, Bob, Glenn O'Brien, Michael Netter are there by that point.
These are 2 friends of mine from Georgetown who I brought in to help with the interview and the video.
And that's when Andy asked me to go full time, gives me the keys to the studio, and I get $65 a week.
Yeah, well, Paul Morrissey, first off, what happened is after about 6 months of going to hand-in interviews, one time Andy took me up to Lincoln Center, did Polaroids of me where I looked like Elvis Presley before Las Vegas. You know, Andy can make anybody look like a beauty. And so, you know, we would chat and stuff. So one day I come up to hand in an interview, and the 10th floor office was padlocked. So I went down to the 6th floor, and Andy said, oh, Paul wants to talk to you. And so Paul said, you know, I went over to talk to Paul, and he said, oh, you know, we had to fire Soren. He was like taking the $25 checks for contributors and turning them to $250 checks and cashing them. And so, and he said, well, Andy and I thought you could be the editor. And I'm like, me? I never edited anything. I'm at Columbia Film School now getting a master's. And he's like, oh, well, you could get credits from them. We'll pay you $50 a week. No, $40 a week. I said, $40 a week? Even then, that was really a little. He said, well, it's a part-time job. You're still going to be going to school. So I said, well, let me think it over. And I went back up to Columbia, and Glenn O'Brien and his wife, Judy, were like so excited with this idea that they said, well, Glenn said, maybe I could be your assistant, and Judy will work like free as an intern. She quickly changed her name to Jude Jade because she was hoping that Andy would make her a superstar, and she wanted to have the right name. And so I went back the next day and I said, you know, Paul, I'll work for $50 a week. My friend Glenn will work for $40. Anyway, he went along with that. He said, so I said, you know, when do we start? What do we do? He said, oh, well, Andy, Fred, and I are going to the Venice Film Festival with Trash, I guess. And he hands me an envelope and says, just put one. He said, it's really easy. You just go to this hippie place, this other magazine, other scenes. They'll help you with the layouts. Then you go to this printer in Chinatown. It's, you know, just. And he hands me an envelope and says, and put one of these photos on every page. So I take the photos out of the page, and it's stills of Rita Hayworth. And I said, well, Paul, what does Rita Hayworth have to do with, interview was called a film journal when it started. And it had mostly reviews of European movies and underground movies. He said, I would just put one on every page. So I was brought up to do what the boss tells you to do. So that's what I did. And I remember Glenn and I, you know, had it printed in Chinatown, where the Chinese printer did not understand less ink. So half the 5,000 print run had to be thrown away immediately. And we were told, bring some issues to Anthology Film Archive, where Jonas Mekas gives them out for free. So we go see Jonas Mekas, who's like the guru of underground film, and this very distinguished Central European intellectual who I guess had fled Hitler from Czechoslovakia. And he's going through this first issue. And then he looks up and he says to me, you are a genius. You have entirely reinvented the concept of a magazine. This is wonderful. The photos have nothing to do with the text. So the next issue, we put Elvis Presley photos on every page.
So great. So was there ever any idea that, because the interview changed obviously over the years and became, you know, bigger scale, you know, colored, you know, Richard Bernstein's art on the cover. Was there ever any belief that it could make money, or was?
No, that was the goal. But it took about 10 years. But you know, I mean,
It took 10 years. It took longer than
about
that.
1980, I think we made a little money.
So it was really being supported by everything else that was going on.
Yeah, no, the commissioned
Essentially the art
portraits
for the most
especially.
part.
And there weren't, I mean...
Yeah, because the process was, because Andy starts, the first issue of Interview comes out in October 1969. And then it starts out, and Bob was instrumental in transforming it from a film journal to what, you know, to a more
We had
gossip
fashion
color.
designers who were
So, and at
working
the
for
same
movie
time,
stars.
I started videotaping with Michael Nettard in 71, 72. And then 73, Michael leaves to pursue his own art and his own business. And then I finally find my niche as doing I was the video department, which was small, because I realized that Paul Morrissey wasn't going to teach me about filmmaking, which I really wanted to do. I held the boom mic for Trash, his film Trash. That was as close as I got. But that's where Andy helped, because we were all young. You know, that's what we were called the kids. We were all our 20s.
It was learning on the job,
he
right.
let all of us, he gave us the empowerment to do what we needed to do, though he was absolutely in control. It was not like he looked at everything. In early days when he had 2 Sony decks and there was a sound lag when you hit it physically and try to make a cut, he would walk in right when I made a bad cut, every time. But he was very supportive.
He would, when a new issue came out, you know, and it came from the printers, I would bring it to Andy, and he would go through counting the pages of ads. And he would be like, oh, 40 pages. What did we have last month? I'd say 35. Oh, that's good. You know, but he was very focused on selling ads. When I started there, the paper was being backed in a small way by Jerome Hill, who was an heir of the Northern Pacific Railroad fortune and happened to be the uncle of Peter Beard. And Peter Beard was doing photos for us. And then after 2 years or so, by 72, I think he got tired of losing $50,000 a year or something. So Peter Brandt and Joseph Allen, who were cousins who were in the newsprint business and collecting Andy's work already, and were very close to Fred Hughes, they bought Jerome Hill's 50%. And then after 4 years or so of their investing money, they wanted out, and Andy bought back the 50% by giving them some paintings.
Yeah,
which became very
Fred
valuable.
brokered that whole thing was to get 100% control.
But no, Andy, we were, there's a whole chapter in Holy Terror called Portraits and Ads, Ads and Portraits, because Andy figured out that I could talk to anyone, so I would be good for selling the portraits. And he would always be asking me, did you pop the question? Oh, you went to see Lily Auchincloss last night? Did you pop the question? Did you tell her she doesn't have many years left before she'll look good enough to have her portrait? I'd be like, Andy, that's not, Or it would be, oh, I saw you talking to Calvin Klein in Studio 54 last night. Did you sell any ads? It's like, Andy, it was 3 in the morning. He was like, that's the best time to sell ads. And then he hired my sister away from right out of the Yves Saint Laurent boutique, because she had studied acting at Rider College. Of course, she couldn't get an acting job. So Fred Hughes was actually married to Marina Schiano, who was running the Yves Saint Laurent business in America. And so Marina hired my sister. And Andy would go into the Yves Saint Laurent boutique on Madison and 70th to buy silk blouses for his housekeepers. And he would say to me, your sister's the best salesgirl. She's the only one who runs down to the basement stockroom when they don't have the size. Why is she making money for Yves? She should be making money for us. And I said, Andy, my mother said, never work with a relative. And one day he came and said, oh, don't yell at me, Bob. I just hired your sister. It worked out really fine. It worked out well.
I mean, one thing, I'm very interested in the 50s and have done a lot of research on that and spoke with Andy about that period in the 50s. And I remember.
Well, just to interrupt, by the way, I just want to let you know that Donna was able to interview Andy about his 50s work. The only time that I witnessed that to happen was it was about 1985-ish.
Yeah, 85, 86.
And Andy, by that time, he did not want to do interviews. And I had to pull teeth to get people in, but that was a miracle.
Yeah, I mean, it was an amazing experience. I will say, to have that, it changed.
I met you when the show opened.
That's right.
At Gray
That's
Hotel.
right. That's right. Actually, I think we might have even met with the Dia show with hand-painted images, because that was the show at 77 Worcester Street, and I think maybe it was at that time. And that was very, informative for me, and I was just thinking about, when you talk about his great business skills, and, and he made it happen. It makes me think so much about that 50s era and him getting jobs in commercial art. Do you know if any of those people from the 50s, I know Otto Fenn, who was a fashion photographer, there's correspondence where he continued a dialogue with Andy. Did they come to the factory?
No, no, but Andy kept.
Well, Tina Fredericks.
Well, Tina Fredericks, but
Deanna Vreeland.
If you walk down the street with Andy, which I did a lot when I'd be picking him up, and so somebody would come up to him and he'd say hi, and I'd say, so who was that? Oh, they gave me my first job. Well, that happened more than once. I said, who really gave it? It was Tina Fredericks.
Tina Fredericks.
He remembered every art director that he worked with. He didn't forget. But people, lives change and intersect. But he always remembered the people he worked with. And later, after he died, there were so many, he'd left and given so many drawings to them from the 50s.
But also in the 50s, there was kind of like this gay society, let's say. I mean, mostly in the fashion world. But, people like Kenny Lane, Halston, they were all friendly with Andy in the 50s.
We have a portrait of Kenneth J. Lane in the show.
And they all won, their idol was Truman Capote, because he had made it, he was taken seriously in the literary world and in society as an openly gay man. And so there were, people like Consuelo Crespi, had worked under Deanna Vreeland at Bazaar when Andy was, showing. Lily Auchincloss worked at Bazaar for Deanna Vreeland. When Andy would show up with his drawings in a brown paper bag, they called him Andy Paper Bag.
Right.
And so, for Andy, I think to, let's say, do the portrait of Lily Auchincloss, which never happened, was like a big thing. This society girl who worked at Bazaar, and now he's the big artist, and she's on the board of MoMA. So there was continuity,
Going back
Susie Frankfurt was his good friend.
Forever. And then
and
she carried over to the 70s
Yeah.
and 80s. But Tina Fredericks was the woman who found the house in Montauk for Andy and Paul.
Because she then
'Cause
went
they
into
made-
real
Paul-
estate,
Paul
right, out in
and
the East
An-
End.
Yeah, Paul and
She
Andy
became
made money on
believing.
trash. And so they were able to buy the house for $240,000, I think. And I remember driving out there with Joe
But
D'Alessandro.
Susie Frankfurt actually helped Andy with all those books, Wild
they
Raspberries.
collaborated.
Wild Raspberry,
And,
yes.
you know, she was part of the assembly line doing the hand painting.
And
they stayed
her
friends
husband
forever.
was the VP at Young
He had
and
the
Rubicon.
Coca-Cola account.
And so Andy did do some work, some commercial work, but it never made it. It was supposed to be for
And
television.
Susie converted to Catholicism. Remember that? Her baptism? Were you there? When the priest asked, as St. Ignatius Loyola, who's your godparent? And she pointed to Andy, and Andy pointed to Fred.
Can you both say a bit about, you know, for people here, because in a way, one of the people that was equally very important to the whole operation was Fred Hughes.
More than Fred Hughes was Andy's main business manager. Fred starts in 1967, and they get to know each other at the Philip Johnson Glass House at a benefit. Fred was already working with the DeMille in Houston and worked with Yolas in Paris. Yolas, just to be clear, was Andy's champion starting in 1952 with the Hugo Gallery, and that's where the Capote drawings first were exhibited. So Fred was, at the age of 26, an extraordinary relationship with Andy, really guided his career, was the one with Bruno Bischofberger and Thomas Simon later, to really focus on Europe, since the United States was looking at Andy as a famous artist. But in the 70s, they started, you know, the negative thing about he's just a society portrait artist. And the Europeans took Andy much more seriously.
Let's talk about the portraits a bit, because we obviously have this gallery on
Incredible
the lobby
room.
level.
Beautiful.
And one of the inspiration for it, in a sense, came from a comment that there was this idea that the portraits were standardized to the 40 by 40 format, although as you'll see in the gallery, we had 3 that show up
Yeah,
that are
that
not
was-
40 by
yeah.
40, but we've made them work. But that there was this idea maybe of creating a portrait of society.
Yeah, Andy said that to me. He was very flexible, you know, with the client's requests, and not, you know, I helped sell some of them, so then I would be the go-between, and I'd say, you know, they sort of like a pink background, or he'd say, oh, do you think they want, the, you know, more painterly or more, you know, but when some clients would say, can I have 36 by 36? It'll fit better over my mantelpiece, or can I have a larger size? And Andy was very rigid about not everything having to be 40 by 40. And I asked him one day why he was so rigid about that. And he said, oh, because someday I want one of every portrait I've done of every person all put together in one big painting where they all would be touching, and it would be called Portrait of Society, and it should be at the Metropolitan Museum. Well, now it's at the Whitney,
Well, 'cause I know
because
Donna-
Donna was smarter than
Donna,
the
you
people
were,
at the
you were
Met.
surprised because when he did the portrait of Debbie Harry, it's a 42 by 42. Susie Frankfurt's 44
Yeah,
by
that's
44.
weird.
Well, that's where he kind of veered off. But Andy was like that, because when he published his own prints, he did things where publishers wouldn't want, like he'd drop a half tone out or a line drawing, or he'd make them completely unique. So he had
Well,
these
also,
quirky
Andy,
things.
He was into repetition. So like when McDonald's opened in Union Square, he had McDonald's every day. He didn't want brownies, tuna fish sandwiches anymore, or whatever.
Well, we went to
And then
Balducci's
he would
after.
have but he would do the same thing for like 6 months. And then, so his assistants would get used to like getting him a McDonald's burger. And then he would say, I didn't say I wanted a McDonald's burger. He would then like switch, like just when you thought you knew exactly
Right.
what Andy wanted,
Right.
he would switch
Right.
and keep things
He'd
off
be
balance.
zigging and then he'd zag,
Yeah,
right? Just to keep you
Because
on
he
your
never
toes.
really wanted anybody to, you know, you
Well,
couldn't pigeonhole.
He would create a rule and then break it, you
Right.
know.
Which is what the work is
Yeah,
all about.
he was creative.
I
He
mean,
was
the idea of
imaginative.
pushing things, how far can you go and have it be called a painting or a print? We have the sunset prints, which are 632
For that
unique
hotel in
silk screens
in
for the
Minneapolis.
hotel that Philip Johnson.
But you know, with that, they were collated, and once they got the bulk of them back, they were collated into 4 prints into each portfolio.
Right.
But each one was unique, so I would tell people, do you want hot colors or cool colors?
So-
Because that's
they're
what you
so
get. And if
beautiful.
somebody, I remember somebody got something, it was lost, they sent it by UPS or whatever, and I said, well, that's it. That was a unique print, but I can get you one like it, maybe. But those are such beautiful
They're
prints.
so beautiful. And let me ask, because we're, you know, there's a specific work in the exhibition which is very near, it's right near the silk screens, which is the plexiglass sculpture, which I remember when I was adjunct curator for the Warhol Museum, and I had an office at 33rd Street. Bridget was in the next office next to me. It was kind of amazing when I think
That
she
was the
always
last factory.
The last
Yeah,
factory,
that's the Con Ed substation.
and she was listening to tapes. That was her
To
job.
identify people.
Yeah, and every once in a while she would call over to me and say, "Does this sound like Jimmy Carter?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't know." And I'm like just a young curator working here. But on the filing cabinets in the back was that plexiglass
Well, the
sculpture.
I never saw that, because I was-
the plexiglass
You don't
sculpture.
remember it's the
it's
one that's sort of stacked with it. It's a
But what-
mystery to us, this piece.
a mystery until.
Okay, great. We want this.
When I arrived in '69, that sculpture, because everybody asked me, but there was it was three Mylar rolls in the plexi support or armature, and then we found other pieces. So after Andy died, that's now where it goes. That's the full piece of the way. It was part of Andy experimenting with sculpture.
Yeah.
Because every once in a while he would go, besides the boxes, the Campbell soup can, and Del Monte, so those boxes are done. But he every time he got it, it didn't work. So this was the most interesting one. So I was able to say I saw it. It exists. It wasn't something made up. It was his sculpture.
Yeah, it's a really beautiful piece,
Yeah.
and it's.
I think it's a surprise for almost everyone.
Yeah, I always think it's also great to see if an artist has an idea and they don't pursue it. I mean, it's just
He
interesting.
wanted to do furniture for a while, so he got some kind of pine wood furniture, which was kind of not particularly well made, and painted on it. And then eventually we put the fax machine on it, and that was the end of it.
Well, one of the great series we have is in the exhibitions that I think as they scroll through, we will see, Bob, you were sort of the test case for the Ladies and Gentlemen
Yeah, I
series.
was hoping that photo would not appear.
It's going to
tonight,
follow
but
you the rest of your life.
I don't believe in censorship, so.
There's a whole videotape which I did. It was a Saturday afternoon. It was Gigi Williams, Ronnie Catrone, me, and Andy and Bob. And
Well,
Bob was such a
that's-
good sport.
That series started, like many of Andy's series of paintings, with an art dealer called Luciano Anselmino, who was based in Torino, and we used to call him Anselmino of Torino.
So here we go.
Yeah.
All right, you don't have to look. Don't look. It's
All
okay.
right, so he was a protege of Yolas, actually, and he was kind of very flamboyant and very funny. And we were driving from Torino, where Fred had Andy, me, Paloma Picasso, and Nikki Weymouth locked up in some art camp for sort of fancy Italian ladies who were learning about art for 6 weeks. I think we were there for 2 weeks. And then we were finally rescued by Anselmino, and we were on our way to Monte Carlo to meet up with Fred. So that's about a 3-hour car ride. So Anselmino says, Andy, I have a great idea for you. I want you to paint drag queens, but not beautiful, successful drag queens. I want you to paint black and Puerto Rican boys who, have heavy beards and they're coming through. They don't really work, so you could see that they're guys. And
Slightly dodgy description, but okay, we'll go with that.
No, he was Italian. It's a different time. You didn't say Hispanics. Most of the Hispanics in New York were Puerto Rican still. The Dominican invasion, or I shouldn't say invasion, Dominican wave hadn't come in yet. But so Andy right away says, "Oh, Bob, you could be. Oh, Bob has a heavy beard. You have a 5 o'clock shadow." I'm like, Andy, I am not posing in drag, okay? I don't want to do that. He's like, but why? I'll give you a painting. I was like, Andy, just let's drop the subject. I'm not doing this. I'll give you 2 paintings. And I'm like, well, how big? So all the way to Monte Carlo, we're having this fight, which of course Andy loved these fights because he was tape recording them. And then he could tell Pat the next day Bob was being so difficult for the diary, or Bob had another nervous
You sort of
breakdown.
couldn't get away with anything, could you? Because he was taping everything,
Yeah,
no?
so, but you just got used to it. And we forgot about it. And, well, he kept pressing me. And finally, one Saturday, I don't even remember why I finally agreed.
I don't either, but you
But
did.
I did it, and it was a disaster. And he said, "Oh, these aren't really good." I said, "I told you." And
Well, Bob, you were. Look, you have to get the videotape, which is brilliant.
which I'm glad we don't have here tonight.
Because Bob is trying, Andy keeps asking him to hold his hand and kind of set him away. And Andy and I are directing him, saying, "We look, get the come hither look." And so Andy finally goes and and Andy has these very graceful hands and was doing the poses. Bob is a little more uncomfortable. So we had him in one outfit. Then we got you in the halter top with, I wrote an essay about this where it's called Better
I wasn't
in
even
Bangs.
taking drugs. I mean,
But Gigi Williams and Andy wanted to have more makeup on. And so he tried really hard. Bob was such a good sport. Pat Hackett had gone out and got the wigs from May's department store, someplace on 14th Street. So there were just the two, but actually the banks. But you two both look at the Polaroids and you make a selection. But that's really triggered Andy. We had to go. Bob went to the Gilded Grape and Corey
Well, you
Tippin.
came to a
and
few nights too.
Yes, we did.
I think Kenny Lane. Someone took us to this bar one night called the Gilded Grape on 8th Avenue and 46th
Like Hell's
Street.
Kitchen. It was a great place.
Yeah, when that neighborhood was really dangerous. But it was a hilarious place because it was where it seemed like African American and Latino drag queens went to meet white truck drivers on their way home to New Jersey.
And there was a dance contest.
And there was a dance contest. And the funny thing was the African American drag queens would do Kim Novak and Marilyn Monroe, and the white ones would do Diana Ross, and so it was like complete. And the waiters all wore sailor uniforms, but were like Barchester. They had little sailor caps, and it was totally surreal.
It was a great place.
And we brought Andy there one night, and he had his Brownies plastic shopping bag under his chair with the first chapter of the philosophy book, and some tapes, and whatever, and it was stolen. So he never wanted to go back. But we would actually bring ladies.
Yeah, don't you remember we tell them to take their jewelry off and leave them in the limousine before you got in because you had to walk a gauntlet.
We brought Sarah Schlumberger there one night, and she said, "Oh, that girl looks just like Marie Helene de Rothschild." And it was like funny. She said that one looked like you when we brought her here. I mean, but these girls, I mean, we would say to them, if this friend of ours would love to take Polaroids of you. And,
You didn't say it was Andy Warhol, did you?
No, and they would come down to the factory the next day, and Vincent would get them to sign a release, and Andy would do the Polaroids. And the next night they would say, "Tell your friend I do a lot more for $50." I mean,
no, because it was started at 33 Union Square West and carried over to 860 Broadway when we moved in '74.
Oh, that's right.
And because there's a shot where all the boxes are packed up. But I would have a checkbook out. They sign a release. I write a check for $50. Then I would call the Chemical Bank on 17th Street in Park Avenue South. And I knew the manager, and I knew the tellers. I said, there are going to be a number of people coming in. Just cast the checks and it's fine.
Yeah.
And so I got a call back. Did you know a Helen or a Harry Morales? And I said, that's it. Give her the write the checks.
We
fine.
have those Polaroids actually in the case, and I think what's so amazing. There's a great essay in the catalog that Glenn Ligon has written about.
those are fabulous paintings, by the way.
They're really, the colors in the pictures are really.
And they're very painted.
And when we have, they've always been called Ladies and Gentlemen, which of course is the title, but we have included the names of the sitters, and it's been really fascinating. With Marsha P. Johnson, who was such a major gay rights activist, and Wilhelmina Ross.
Wilhelmina Ross, Andy does, I think, the most of portraits of and drawings. I mean, that's a catalog resonating question, but that is, to me, there was lots of, and that was quite, but it was an interesting moment. I mean, they really performed for Andy. That's why we didn't say, when we moved in 1974 from 33 Union Square West, 860 Broadway, we didn't tell the building super who was moving in after we had this hard time getting the space. So one day, Ronnie and I had the van. We were loading up boxes in the freight elevator. The freight elevator goes to the third floor, and the boxes tip over, and there's Andy's porn all over the floor. Gay porn. So we kind of laughed and put stuff back in the box. And that was the indication that Super knew who was coming. Not particularly Andy yet, but something was strange happening.
But also, the hammer and sickles grew directly out of the drag queens.
Right.
Because the drag queens were shown in Palazzo di Diamanti, this beautiful Renaissance palace in Ferrara, Italy, and there was a big press conference. Andy was huge in Europe, in a much more serious way than in the U.S. at that point. And Italy was going through this phase where communism was very fashionable, and the Communist Party was very powerful. The Red Brigades, it was a confusing time in Italy. But a lot of the intellectuals were communist or very left wing, and they were all asking Andy, well, didn't you paint these paintings to show that because of capitalism in the United States, African American and Hispanic boys have no choice but to become transvestite prostitutes. And Andy was like, "Oh, gee, Bob, is that why I did that?" And so we try to field these questions. He always threw the questions to Vincent or me or Bridget or Paul Morrissey. He always wanted someone sitting in on his interviews. The journalists would be furious because they didn't come to interview Bob Colacello. They came to interview Andy Warhol, so he'd get bad press. But Andy also believed bad publicity was good publicity. We now have a president who's kind of following that formula. But anyway, so Andy said to me in Ferrara, "Oh, they really want communist paintings in Italy. I got to do more communist paintings." And we got back to New York, and the next day he had Ronnie Catrone go to a hardware store and buy a hammer and a sickle. And they started taking Polaroids of the hammer and sickle.
Because that's before Andy started taking his own photographs. But
what's so interesting is, it's so, the way you describe it, and he's like, "Oh, that's what they want." But then when you look at the number of works that were done of the hammer and sickle, the paintings, the drawings,
he got into it.
the prints, that I think this is where there's always a little bit of the unfortunate disconnect that happens in terms of the art itself and his willingness to stay with it. And they're beautiful, they're lyrical.
As you know, they were called still lifes. So
they were called still
He
lives.
deconstructed
Yes.
the communist idea, so it was like the two pieces. And then with the skulls, but what happened, and correct me if I'm wrong, was there was supposed to be, the skulls and the hammer sickles, were supposed to be shown in Italy, but because of the
Together.
The political climate was so
got worse and worse.
Worse and worse.
It was dangerous.
They were afraid bombs and
right.
whatever. So Leo Castelli
Right.
shows the hammer and sickles, but the skulls didn't really get to see the light of day as an exhibition till later.
But the hammer and sickles, my understanding, that's the first exhibition in New York after he had been shot. I think that's the very first.
Yeah. Mao's showed in Paris.
Yeah, Mao's in
Mao's
Paris.
in Paris, I'm pretty certain. And,
You might be right.
Yeah, there was a small show at the School of Visual Arts.
Oh, right. They stole,
Right.
we did, the Schools of Visual Arts, we had hammer and sickle drawings, and somebody stole one, believe it or not.
Well, I think that Castelli, they were relatively successful commercially.
Johnny Agnelli bought one of the really big ones. And I remember we went to Rome and saw his...
I'm looking at this, I'm getting verification of this, yes, in the audience. Thank you very much. It impresses me so much, that period, because that's also a period with the hammer and sickle, the skulls, and this incredible, which we see upstairs, this whole the interest in the shadow. And, if Ronnie Catrone suggested the idea, it's always this, many people always say to me, I've found that over the years, you probably have too, that people say, well, it wasn't Warhol's idea. And it's like, well, it doesn't matter where it came from. That, to me, is, his genius. He would take the idea, but he would make it his own.
But he also asked everyone for ideas, the elevator man, everybody.
Well,
but
not Mike the Super.
Well, he asked a lot of people for ideas, but he would, 99% of them he never did anything with. He knew when there was, an idea was a Warhol idea, like philosophy.
What do you mean by that, when you say he knew when something was a Warhol?
Like the way he jumped on the philosophy, like right there. He knew that word philosophy, which leads me to believe Andy always, and he was a kind of philosopher, he was a kind of sociologist. I think all of that is why his work has lasted and become a global phenomenon, because there's so much, let's say, beyond art that's in the work, and so much about the times.
A social observer, and the course at Carnegie. Actually, there's that great living room work up in the show, and we have very few with the early works, but I think that work is so compelling because it was a class assignment on social observation.
Right.
And so, his capacity to visualize, but also, this brings up this whole question too of being, I've always thought that in some ways he was sort of an insider, obvious insider, but then also an outsider. That's always been my perception from my little bit that I...
Well, don't forget
his background, his Catholicism, his immigrant background, certainly.
He was a famous artist, but that people got very nervous if he went into other mediums like television or a movie. They wanted to keep him pigeonholed as he's an artist, and that's why I think a lot of the critics of the day disliked him on across the board because he wasn't acting or behaving what they thought an artist should be. He wasn't, in a lonely studio by himself, angry, drinking a fifth of booze every day and He was out in the world with everybody, and they resented that aspect. But he was an outsider because every time we tried to do something in the entertainment business like television stuff, because he had gone out to Hollywood before my time, and they flew him out to put him down. And when we were promoting our TV show after.
What do you mean they flew him out to put him down?
Well, because they didn't want, because films were unscripted. Paul Morrissey was doing stories beginning, middle, and endings.
Right.
Andy didn't really care about that. He was one of the dialogue. But when we were trying to pitch the TV show, a producer from the early HBO said, oh, they want us to do something. So I told the producer, this better be right, because I'm going to bring Andy. And we walked in the door, and I could tell by the guy sitting like this, they hadn't looked at anything, and they put us down and said, no one cares about fashion. You can't, because Andy's idea was to do a show about fashion at that point. So they brought him up to put him down. If you read in the diaries, I'm more upset than he is, because he's already been through this. So he was trying to break into all the different mediums.
He became an insider in some of the most exclusive circles in
Yes,
the world.
exactly.
Whether
it was the clique of Halston and the fashion world, or in Europe with the Rothschilds, the Agnellis, the Dumenils. All of these, the Rockefellers had their portraits done. But he went to the White House with with the Fords, the Carters, the Reagans. He was but the one world where he was still always an outsider was the New York art world, not European art world. And he had, in retrospective at the Tate in 1970, every European, but he could never get a show at MoMA. Bill Rubin thought he was not up to par. Jasper Johnson, artists like that who were in their ivory towers, kind of looked their nose down on Andy for making films, for having a celebrity magazine, for hanging out with fashion designers, whatever the reason, for being too famous, So he could never, we'd have these lunches at the factory once we moved to 860 Broadway, and basically not that many artists came to these lunches. Larry Rivers, Roy came once a year, Cy Twombly would come, Bob Wilson, but
Well, they
Andy,
traded work, Cy Twombly and
but they were friends. But even Leo Castelli, I'm sorry to say, didn't put Andy, in my observation, on the level he put Jasper and Rauschenberg and Stella and Lichtenstein. But when this new wave of painters came in 1980, who all wanted to paint, even though the art was saying it's only conceptual art, it's only video. So suddenly they flocked around Andy. Julian Schnabel,
Francesco Clemente,
Basquiat, Keith Haring, Kenny Scharf. And that was so nice to see Andy have this coterie now of young artists who actually looked up to him because he was rich and famous. They didn't think there was anything wrong with that. And they also were painters. They liked painting.
Andy liked painting.
And a lot of them were figurative painting, which had been declared totally finito.
But in the diaries, there's something, I think, where he says something about the Whitney Biennial in 1983 that with, Cindy Sherman and Barbara Kruger and all this younger generation, and he's sort of like, why am I not a part of that? And so you do get this, sad, it comes through as an incredible sadness.
Well, those, again, were the more conceptual, more intellectual artists who still were snubbing Andy in a way.
Well, because
whereas the real painters...
But the critics were leading the...
Well, the critics in the
the Whitney was the only museum in America who gave him a retrospective.
Whitney, because it is true
in America,
1971.
Right? There was one in Philadelphia
The Pasadena Art Museum show that John Copeland's organized comes to the Whitney. And then in 79, it's the portraits of the 70s. And that was, I think,
you can't believe how
Tom Armstrong,
right,
who was a big supporter.
But all the years I worked with Andy, I don't think there was one good review for any show, and he even talks about it in the diaries.
Yes.
But before he dies, there are the stitched photographs that,
yes.
That was
Robert
the
Miller.
first good American
We have two upstairs.
He gets a good review.
Well, let's talk a little bit about, to me, of course, one of these extraordinary series are the shadows that are shown at Heiner Friedrich. And the skulls, and this, kind of move towards a more abstract image, but also subject matter that's not quite what people still wanted from Warhol.
And
I
that
mean,
really threw off when the review came out, when he did the show with Heiner Friedrich, the critics didn't know what to say. They just attacked him they attacked him as a person. You know, what he did, how he went out. They couldn't fathom
That's
that he
what
was
they had
doing
been asking
abstract.
for, like minimalism and concept. Because it was such, you know, Andy was always saying, "Oh, gee, how can I make an abstract painting that's not really abstract?" And those
which
were,
is the great genius of
Yeah.
it. I mean,
Because,
that's
you
what
know,
I think
the
we
whole
see.
we
thing-
still don't even know what it's a shadow
Well,
of.
because Andy never really wanted, but Ronnie Catrone.
I hope we never know.
Yeah, but you'll never know. Ronnie Catrone.
Vincent knows, he won't say.
Ronnie Catrone got cardboard, you know, pieces, and then you see those shadows. But there's
don't we have
other
this
things
photo?
that, because Ronnie does do an interview, and I know when Heiner Friedrich came to Andy, because he had this mind to do a space, because excuse me, Heiner likes to have permanent spaces. What Paul Morrissey coined is deified. So if you're deified, that means that stays there for the rest of time.
One artist, one place
Yeah,
forever.
one place. So, but part of the shadows, and that's why when you wrote in your essay that it's possibly a penis, a erect penis or something, that's possible too. But Andy never said what it was because there were lots of source material. We looked forever at all the black and white photographs, but he was also doing sex parts and torsos. Now the torsos, and he gets the sex parts. Part of that, and I think it's I found in the diaries. You know, he did asshole paintings, little ones, about that big.
I don't know that I've ever seen those. How did those
really?
get away from
I thought
me?
he sold it. Yeah, well. So part of that, and then there is a passage. Chrissy Effort's coming for the sports figures, athletes, and Victor Hughes was there, and he's bringing out the sex parts and stuff. And we have to, you know, kind of move them away from her.
Yeah, Andy would.
But
go
the
ahead.
thing is, it really is, there is a sexual aspect to it, but you don't know if it's the cardboard shadows or if it's what I call the Dia shadow. There is that shape,
Right.
but you don't know, and Andy never, ever talked about it. So I don't think any of us really know.
No, it could be the
look at-
shadow of a phallus, shall we say.
Yeah.
But the sex parts, I mean, Victor Hugo, who was Holstein's Venezuelan muse, window dresser, boyfriend, who was extremely difficult to understand because he not only had a heavy accent, but braces. And anyway, he was sort of the, well, he read one book on Dadaism, and I think that was the extent of his history of art. And, you know, but anyway, he was the guy who was bringing all the models for the sex parts after hours, like it's after 7 o'clock at night. And I would come in the next morning, and my office was, at interview, was the closest to Andy's studio in the, like, towards the 18th Street side.
This is 860 Broadway.
Yeah, 860 Broadway. And I find these really beyond X-rated photos drying, Andy said, these Polaroids on my desk. Well, my secretary at the time, when secretaries were not called assistants, but secretaries, was Doria Reagan, the president's daughter-in-law. So I was like, Andy, I remember, how could you, you know, oh, well, I didn't know where to put them. I said, Andy, if this whole huge studio, you have to come in my little 8x8 office and put these, you know, what if Doria got here before me? And, you know, so it was always like kind of a drama. And Andy loved to provoke you.
Yeah, but
he loved
the
to
photo
push the
sessions
buttons.
did get removed to Victor's loft on Fifth Avenue and 19th Street, or where we had a loft space. So.
But I think this whole, you know, idea of sort of the work of that time, and Bob, you have a quote where you say, you talked about the shadows as a kind of classicism. They're really very classical. And you said,
That's
but the
true.
Shadows exhibition didn't convert any art world intellectuals to Andy's cause. And so, you know, it's interesting, this whole, the support came from Europe, from Bischofberger, Daniel Templon, Alexander Iolis,
And even Heiner Friedrich
Thomas
was European.
Ammann.
I mean,
Yeah, and that, you know, I mean, now we look at the work and, you know, it seems so fresh, particularly the abstract works
like,
in that
I don't
last
know,
room.
80 or 100, what was shown at Dia? To see them all together.
There were 102.
Well, it's
102.
102,
It was
but the
spectacular.
original show
It
wasn't.
was less. It was 60 maybe?
Maybe, but because
I thought it was 80.
Maybe what Andy asked
was a lot.
Heiner is to get the floor plan so we could measure it, because he put them butted them up together. So we filled that up, and so they were. But the pieces, the paintings, 102 panels, for sure. But you rarely see them. I have to say, the Hirshhorn a few years ago
They
showed
did a
them.
very beautiful
Unbelievable,
installation of them.
concave wall, all 102 was magnificent.
So I think, Bob, as you write, that Andy was quite upset when Basquiat parted ways with him. Could you talk, because they did the show together, the collaborations that were shown at Shafrazi, and, you know, much has been written also about the 80s, and there's a great essay in the catalog by Jessica Beck about the specter of AIDS, a lot of losses that are going on at that time. And, you know, the Last Supper, which I just think is, especially Camouflage Last Supper, it's just, to me, it's just an extraordinary work. I still can't figure it out. I've been going up there and looking
Right.
at it, and I'm very happy I can't figure it out,
Right.
because I think that's why I keep coming back to it. And the whole, you know, what we found out afterwards, you had all known about his Catholicism. Presumably that wasn't a well-kept secret amongst all
Well, he
of
would
you.
run into church on Sundays. I don't think he said through entire masses
No, because if I picked him up, if it was on a Sunday, we would go by the
to St. Vincent
St.
Ferrer.
Ferrer, and he would go in, I'd wait outside in 10 or 15 minutes, and we'd continue walking.
Was
And-
that weekly, pretty
No,
much?
yeah,
Sundays.
Sundays.
And that's when if you walk down the street, that's when you start philosophizing or telling stories about the 50s. You get things that you wouldn't normally talk about. That was like a one-on-one, because don't
Does it
forget,
open a kind of space for
Andy
him
was
in a way?
actually a
Yes, it
very good.
brought him back to his
Yeah, Andy
childhood.
was a very good conversationalist, if you want to be. His public persona was shut down and say as few words as possible and have everybody else talk for him. Same thing, because of the assassination attempt, all of us were in a sense of bodyguards. And if people came in too close,
Andy was
we
very
moved
funny
in.
too.
Yeah,
I
he had a
mean,
great sense of humor.
And you know, I mean, you see it in the couple of chapters in the philosophy book where it's
Absolutely.
me and him going back in
Yes.
the hotel in Monte Carlo. We used to call it our Abbott and Costello act, like he would, you know. And but I think the Catholicism, in terms of his art and the influence on his art, the important thing to remember, which we didn't really know so much until, in my case, until he died and I started writing this book and went to Pittsburgh, was he was not Roman Catholic, he was Byzantine Rite Catholic, Eastern Rite Catholic, because he came from a part of Europe called Ruthenia, which was on the sort of on the borders of Slovakia, Ukraine, in the Carpathian Mountains, and the people there were Russian Orthodox. And in the 16th century, it was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Habsburg emperors made a deal with the bishops in that province and got them to recognize the Pope, but keep the Eastern Rite Mass with the iconostasis. Andy's church was actually called St. John Chrysostom Greek Russian Catholic Church, and it had that screen of saints in a grid with, you know, Byzantine painting with the gold leaf backgrounds, very two-dimensional. And when I saw that, John Richardson had the same sort of epiphany. He said, this is where the portraits come from. I mean, these, you know, from these Byzantine portraits of the saints, because Andy's mother didn't really speak English. Her life revolved around the church. Andy was a sickly child. She took him, you know, she really was protective of him. She brought him to Vespers every Saturday night, which was a 2-hour ceremony, and to 3 masses on Sunday, like
And
9.
he would go
He
as a
would go
young
with
child.
her. And the Eastern Rite Mass is like 2 hours long. So for 8 hours a week, he was staring at this screen of saints. And for me, more and more, I see Andy's art as religious art for a secular culture. You know, because when you think about it, even the hammer and sickle, the dollar sign, Mao, they're all objects of worship. And Jackie, Liz, Elvis, Marilyn, they're all like Catholic martyrs. You know, we worship them. People have visions of Elvis in parking lots. I mean, that's like, you know, well, it's like, you know, the Virgin Mary.
Or on a piece of toast.
On a-
That happens periodically too, right? So, but I think a lot is about, you know, belief and the belief in the image.
And
Well, not
symbols.
just for him,
Yeah.
but for all of us. And, you know, in working on this show, I've said so many people have asked me, you know, what do you think he would make of Instagram and of, you know, digital media? And I said, you know, I don't know. I mean, I would not answer that because it would be presumptuous.
But
But
he was interested in technology because
Always, really.
He always jumped on
he
it.
was approached by Commodore Computers to launch the Amiga computer, and they brought technicians in. This is when we were at 33rd Street. And he worked for like 2 weeks with technicians to learn how to use the complicated computer for those days. And he live in Lincoln Center, I think Mitzi Newhouse Theater. Shelley, my wife, Debbie Harry, and Andy went there, and he painted on the computer Debbie Harry's portrait, and was very open, talking. By this time, he'd been on his own TV show, So he was a little less shy, but he did a perfect job. So I very seldom ever think about, I don't speak for him, but I think Instagram or something like that would have been very much his, because it was immediate, you could get things done. He would have learned it. Now Bob still has a flip phone.
Well, but Andy used to say, we wrote this too, and maybe philosophy, that he thought, everything that he did and we did in terms of work should be fast, easy, cheap, and modern. Modern meaning new. Because he felt if something took too long or cost too much, was too labored, it meant you shouldn't be doing that. It wasn't the right thing for you to be doing as a creative person, or for him to be doing. So I think he would have loved social media, Instagram, because it's instant, But he did. He was like one of the first to get on Polaroids, one of the first to tape record people, and then when the portable one came out, he carried it everywhere. As soon as the 35 millimeter mini cameras came, he switched to, black and white.
But you know who's
video. He's one of the first to get into
Thomas
video.
Amon.
Thomas Amon introduces him to
He
that.
sees that 35 millimeter camera and he runs back to New York and gets
Thomas
it immediately.
came to Andy's hotel suite in Zurich, and he had this camera, and Andy was, I want that. And Thomas went looking all over Zurich. It was sold out everywhere. And our next stop was Bonn, where Andy was going to do the portrait of the Chancellor, Willy Brandt. And we found in a photo store 2 cameras, 2 Minix 35 millimeter, and Andy said, he bought one for me, and he got one, and he said, I have a great idea. We'll take the same pictures every place we go, and then we'll do a book where my contact sheets will be on one page and yours will be on the other, of the same things. Of course, it never worked out that way. We did a book called Exposures, where like about 20% of the photographs were actually mine, but we said were Andy's, but that was like what happened. And I have to say the foundation was very good about scrupulously returning to me every photograph that had BC written on the back.
That's right. And then you did your own book of photographs, too.
Yeah, I did. But no, when you worked with Andy, you just, I think that's the way geniuses work. They kind of take, what is genius but a unique vision? And they stick to that vision and only take from people what you could contribute to that vision. But you have to be careful. If you stay too long, they might take too much.
Well, I think, we could just go on, right?
Right.
But, then we'd all have to get sleeping bags, and you'd all thin out a little bit, and then we'd have to feed you, and then it would get really complicated. So I think we're going to open it up to some questions. My colleagues have the mic, so I don't know if the house lights go up or what, but if people do, and there it is.
Look at that magic.
The Whitney group is just amazing. So questions? There's one. Do you mind standing,
Sure.
just so we know who you are or can see you?
Hi. I just had a question. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about Andy's work as a painter, because I read Bob's Holy Terror book, and I was a little surprised to learn that Andy mainly worked with one studio assistant at a time.
That's correct.
Whereas we have an impression now, I think, that he had a whole army of people making his work. So maybe if you could...
how that worked would be, he had a printer, like Alex Heinrique in the 70s. Before that, had somebody else. But if you look at it in the 60s, it was Gerard Malanga. Ronnie Catrone in the 70s, because Ronnie had met Andy as a teenager and danced with the Velvet Underground a bit, and then he kind of came back in Andy's life when I was around. He was sent to interview to work, and it was a disaster, and I was getting complaints, so I said to Andy, why wouldn't Ronnie be, your artist assistant? I think he'd be really good. So that worked. So that was, and then later it was the last one was Jay Shriver. Now there were other people around, but it wasn't like if Jeff Koons has got 40 people working for him. It was very archaic in that sense. So it was very small.
It's a kind of cottage industry by comparison.
But Andy was great at creating myths and mystery about himself. Starting in the 50s when he did the first interviews like for trade journals and art direction and advertising, where he'd give a different birthplace in every interview. McKeesport, Newport, Rhode Island, Philadelphia.
Do you think, though, in the end, if I could just interject, do you think that I don't want to say backfired, but because that myth,
he
we only
created
thought
this
about
myth that we have a factory, and he made it sound like he wasn't. I'm a machine.
Like he wasn't making the work.
Yeah,
which
because
is,
that
of
was
course,
more
not
like
the case at all.
a pop idea. but it wasn't really true. And that particular idea did backfire because people were like, well, Andy doesn't do his own paintings and Andy doesn't mix his own color. His assistants would, but I saw him mix colors
Yeah,
too.
no, the thing, here's
or object to the colors
where
the way
it really came back to bite him was when he said an offhand statement, oh, Bridget does my paintings. Well, the European collectors went ballistic. Fred had to do damage control. And in D'Antonio's painter's painting,
Right.
that's brought up, and Bridget's sitting there with Andy and stuff, and it's very funny. It's clear that Bridget was not doing his work, and they addressed that whole thing, but we had to take that back out. It's like Andy saying, I want to be a robot, I'm not hands-on. Actually, the process of silk screening and using the squeegee's hands-on in by the early 70s, he's finger painting.
his mother's portrait
And I painted-
was finger painted.
I videotaped
it
him
was
painting,
just-
so for that
which
reason.
is one of the most touching portraits.
That's a very beautiful portrait, and I think the thing about, it was brilliant in the 60s because he cut through people's perception of the painter as
He
the
made himself a
romantic
brand,
figure.
to use a
No,
very
it was brilliant, and I'm sure he
21st
got it out of
century
the 50s period of working in fashion and understanding product, but then it's
Even the way he dressed was
perpetuated
part of the
something
brand.
that,
Well,
yes.
because it was part of his art. I always thought, because he used to get a dark eyebrow and a white eyebrow, and I could hardly look at him because it was really disconcerting. Because it's kind of. So he was always playing. So by 1980, he starts cutting his wigs really short. He loses weight, and people said, "Is Andy sick?" I said, "No, he's a male model." He had joined the Zoli modeling agency later. So he really wanted to be one of
He
the
was a
boys.
little
And his
anorexic.
first modeling job was with a bunch of guys for Barney's. But how could Andy be one of the guys?
Right.
But he did go to a lot. He did runway, so I always go with him. And I remember he lost his contact. He fell out. We were on the floor in the dressing room looking for it. But he goes, "Oh, I want to go so I can get all the new people for
We had a
Interview
couple of
magazine."
fights about that.
So, but he would
I
what he did
was
to Bob
against
for
the
the cover.
modeling.
What he did to Bob for promising the cover of Interview at night. He did the same thing when I was a producer of Andy Warhol's TV and later at MTV.
He would give 10
15
covers away in one night at Studio 54.
Then all of a sudden I'd
Tell you,
have to
you should be the
videotape.
cover. Call Bob. You should be the next cover. And I mean, Andy, there were 12 months in the year, and you gave 10 covers away last night.
We'll take another question in the audience. Okay. George, wait, we'll get, Izzy, it's here? We have a question here?
Wait, we'll get
Can't
you a
hear, you
mic.
can't hear.
Hang on. We have to
Mic
give you
coming
the
over.
mic. Mic is coming.
It's coming.
A mic is coming.
We sing a song. Also, you said before that Andy was not so well recepted in the States, in America, in New York.
Yeah.
But you remember they had the Stable Gallery show, super show.
What?
Yeah.
It's the
Stable
Stable
Gallery.
Gallery show.
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
Gold Marilyn was
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, but that's
Philip
the-
Johnson bought it right away. He was accepted in a certain circle very well. Krauschard, you remember the Krauschard collection, all that.
But see, that's the 60s.
Yeah,
when
but-
it gets to
Yeah,
the
but-
70s,
yeah.
people
But
start
also
turning
it
their back.
wasn't.
But you said it was, of course, it's Ludwig, and we had all these people in Europe. But I think in New York there were several great people. They realized from the beginning how great they are. how
Yeah.
great
Yeah, there
they
was,
Yes,
but that was a small.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Irving
But
Blum
I
was
wanted
not-
to say
But
Irving
there was
Blum.
no. I said
Certainly
America.
Irving.
There's no one in Los Angeles that was collecting the work. Irving.
Yeah.
Who and.
But George is making,
No, you're making a
good
point about the 60s, and that's absolutely the
But
case.
when the portraits, that happens in the 70s, I've written about this, but after Andy gets the 68, the assassination attempt, they really feel that he's lost his creativity. He takes a year to recover. So they give him the Mao's in 1972. They have to because this is such a great series. But they don't look at the rest, and that's where it was this brilliant strategy of Fred Hughes, Bruno Bischofberger, to start doing the portraits and focusing. That was the bread and butter. And then you were focusing on Europe to do the shows. Leo didn't understand Andy like Jasper Jones, like Bob said. So Andy actually basically started his own gallery within his studio. Fred Hughes running it. Fred did all the exhibitions. We had European dealers coming in, independent dealers. And there weren't as many shows in the 70s, and you pointed out with the Hammer and Sickle, because the shows were going to Europe. So,
We can take one more question, I think. I think there was someone back there, and then,
I was going to say. Shooting for Interview for 3 years with Mark Ballett, I was always curious to find out how much power or how much hands-on did Andy have in the magazine? In other words, did he review the magazine before it was published?
No.
No, afterwards.
Who
No,
was?
but we would. No, but we would. No, but we would. Mark Ballard and Robert Hayes, who was the managing editor, would have open on Wednesdays. Photographers could bring their portfolios, and it was like totally open. And they would then take. No, but I mean, this was the so they would, pick 2 or 3 if they thought somebody was good, they would say, "Can we hold your portfolio?" And then they would show that to me and to Fred Hughes and to Andy. So Andy also had set down some rules early on with me, which is that he wanted every photo as big as possible, full page if possible, full bleed. He wanted no type on photos. He hated that, and he wanted the layouts very simple. But
So when I shot for you guys, then it went directly to you after with Mark Ballard? And you reviewed it and you decided that's...
no, the photos came into the office, and they came into the office, and Mark Ballard and Robert Hayes and I, we would all look at it, and very often the factory was just flowed into interview, and sometimes Andy would come by, or Fred, or if we were unsure about, let's say, or disagreeing about 2 or 3 choices, we'd bring them over to the factory side and ask, Andy's opinion, or I mean, it was a collaboration.
It follows like everything it did. Once he trusted you, you had to pull the trigger on all the stuff. He wouldn't go on the shoots for our TV show.
No.
We would edit. He would see a almost final edit. When we were on MTV, we were on the phone together watching the show. 2 or 3 days later, he would break it down segment by segment by segment, saying what he wanted changed, what he wanted more of. He wasn't like,
Yeah, with interview,
knew
he
exactly
didn't
what he
criticize
wanted.
it so much.
Yeah.
He accounted but he was a good delegator. But
Yeah.
we also were. From the beginning, I loved Andy's work. You were trying to do what you think Andy would want, So in most cases, I guess we succeeded. But he was
And
totally involved.
I was never involved in actually the image. I was photographing it, but after that, it was on your hands. So.
It was But like any magazine, a group is involved.
yeah.
So I just want to say that some of my colleagues are here who worked on the exhibition, Mark Loacano, Christy Mitchell, Lauren Young, and oftentimes in the course of organizing this exhibition, we would say, what would Andy do? So it's sort of interesting that I think we've sort of channeled that in our thinking, because his solutions were always just seemed so right. So I really want to thank both of you. I mean, we could just go on, but obviously we can't. But thank you so much for participating.
Well, thank you for having us, too.
Well, any time.
Thank you.
Thank
Donna.
you. Good night, all.
All right.